Hey there, fellow travelers. Welcome to the Tolkien Road, episode 353. In this episode, we're continuing our journey through the fall of Númenor by considering the reign of Tar-Atanamir the Great. Before we get started, I'd like to give a double up air five to our amazing fellowship. Stick 'em up, fellowship. 3, 2, 1. Whoopsh. Very nice. Special thanks to this episode's executive producers, John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, and KG. And a big shout out to our newest patron, Jesse N. Thank you so much for joining our fellowship, Jesse. Also, a shout out to those celebrating their fellowship anniversary in November of 2023. Paige H., Matthew F., Michael L., Alaskan Moose 31, Brian H., Chris B., and Daniel S. Thank you all so much for sticking with us over the years. Join the Fellowship of the Road by visiting patreon.com/TolkienRoad. When you join the Fellowship of the Road, it helps us to keep on evering on and lends you some cool perks along the way. Learn more at patreon.com/TolkienRoad. And if you're watching, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and let us know what's on your mind in the comments below. Finally, attention binge listeners, subscribe, rate, and review us on iTunes or the platform of your choice. If you are a 5-star fan of the Tolkien Road, you can really help us out by heading over to iTunes or your preferred source for the show and dropping us a rating and review. When you do that, it helps to get the word out about the Tolkien Road, which helps us to keep on evering on. All right, well, before I dive into this week's episode, this latest episode, I need to address a error from a previous episode. I believe, let me double check here, I believe it was in episode 3, let's see here, episode 350, was it our last one? I think it was, yeah, or 351, I believe. One of the very previous episodes. Well, the listener, watcher, Durenair, pointed out to us that we were mistaken regarding Kirjatur and Kiryatan. So I believe in the course of speaking about Tar-Kiryatan, I had mentioned that he was the leader of the naval force that took on Sauron on behalf of Minastir. And it turns out that I was mistaken about that. I thought, oh, it's his son, and he's kind of like, taking this on for him. It was actually a figure named Kirjatur. And what's really funny about this is it's kind of a Mandela effect moment for me, because I could have sworn that I had checked this, because it registered to me like, wait a minute, he was his son, but he was the admiral at this. It's usually like a ruler and an admiral, like, who works for him, it would either be much older than the admiral, would either be much older than him, or would be like, of the same age. But I didn't make anything of it. I was just kind of like, oh, well, I guess he's kind of just shows how, martially minded a figure he was. He was this young guy, who was an admiral of the fleet. I was like, he's the future monarch, so why couldn't he be the admiral of the fleet? Well, I was just simply wrong. It wasn't Kiryatan, it was Kirjatur. So, Dura Nair, thank you for pointing that out. Very much appreciate it. I just wanted to set the record straight on that. So it was Kirjatur who was the admiral under Minastir, who landed in Middle-earth and pushed the forces of Sauron back. So, and then Kiryatan is the son of Minastir, who became a king, was also a great sea captain, but not the same as Kirjatur. So, addressed, corrected. Thank you once again, Durenair. All right. A little drink of water there. In this episode, we're considered the reign of Tar-Atanamir, the 13th ruler of Númenor. We learn here that Atanamir was given the epithet, the Great. Yet we also learn that he was given another, the Unwilling. I have to admit, it's not entirely clear to me why Tar-Atanamir deserved to be called the Great, though I will explore that issue in this episode. And we will certainly discuss why he was called the Unwilling. At the end of the day, one thing is for certain. Atanamir's reign was of major consequence for the people of Númenor, as his longed-for immortality began to sow the seeds of discontent, restlessness, and malice toward the Eldar, the Valar, and ultimately Eru Ilúvatar himself. The original sources for this portion are primarily Unfinished Tales, The Lord of the Rings appendices, and Akalabath. All right, so let's talk about Tar-Atanamir. Tar-Atanamir, he was the son of Tar-Kiryatan, who, of course, we already mentioned. Atanamir, born Second Age 1800, died Second Age 2221. So he lived to be 421 years old. And I didn't write this down, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that he was the second, of course, next to Elros, who lived 500 years, that Tar-Atanamir was the second longest lived monarch. Let's see here. So, yeah. Wait, was he the first? Atanamir. Yeah, so actually, next to, let's see, let me make sure I have this right. Okay, so his age at death was 421 years old. The next one was, the next one before him, at least, was there was Tar-Amandil and Tar-Telperion, who lived to be 411 years old. So yes, Tar-Atanamir lived longer than any Númenorian monarch, with the exception of Elros himself. So, and that's an important factor that's going to factor into, our discussion of this figure in this chapter, and his significance for the history of Númenor. He also had one of the longest reign spans, though not the longest. His was 192 years, and that ends up ranking tied for third. He actually ties with Eldar, who, of course, we discussed several episodes back, and was a very important figure in Númenorian history as well. So yes, Tar-Atanamir lived to be 421 years old. And we learned that much is said of this king in the annals. There's several different longer passages we're going to read about here, and I think why there's much said of him is because it's not so much because of like great deeds or anything like that. It's because of like the spiritual change that happened. It's really like kind of spiritual transformation that he ushered in to Númenor, and not for the better. Really, not for the better. It was Tar-Atanamir who first spoke openly against the ban and declared that the life of the Eldar was his by right. Okay, so we've discussed this factor of like there had been these kind of grumblings on and with recent monarchs about like, well, why is it that the Eldar get to live forever and we get to live a long time, longer than men, like most like average men, but like still we have to die and leave this world. But it had been kind of like grumblings, like, kind of behind the back, like they wouldn't say it to the, to the face of the Eldar who came to visit or anything like that. But now, Atanamir is just kind of coming out and saying it, like, why? Why am I not allowed to, live forever like the Eldar are? That doesn't make any sense. So he really starts to make that a big issue. And it becomes this thing of envying the Eldar. It sows this seed of envy in his own heart towards the Eldar. So we're going to kind of read some longer snippets from some of these passages and expand upon these. So the first one has to do with the yearning of the Númenorians. Now the yearning of the Númenorians grew ever greater with the years, and they began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life, to escape from death and the ending of delight, grew strong upon them, and ever as their power and glory grew greater, their unquiet increased. For though the Valar had rewarded the Dunedain with long life, they could not take from them the weariness of the world that comes at last. Let me share my screen there so you can see the words I'm reading here. They began to hunger for the undying city that they saw from afar, and the desire of everlasting life, to escape from death and the ending of delight, grew strong upon them. That desire to escape from death and the ending of delight grew strong upon them. And ever as their power and glory grew greater, their unquiet increased. So, as it's kind of like on one hand, their discontent is going up, at the same kind of at a similar rate, or as their power and glory goes up, right? And they are achieving a lot of power and glory because of, their great victories over Sauron, and their really uncontested power over men in Middle Earth. And they want to be able to enjoy it, and not only enjoy it, but enjoy it forever. We all kind of know where they're coming from, don't we? I mean, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, that's not what was afforded to them. That's not how they were made. Even the gift of being able to live longer was simply that. It was a gift. They could not. The Valar literally had no power to take from them the weariness of the world, right? And the fact that they were going to die. That was not something that the Valar could bestow upon them. Remember, the Valar are subject to Eru Ilúvatar, and ultimately it's up to Eru Ilúvatar how all of that is going to work. All right. So the question, why must they die? And I think this is a very, very interesting question. And they said among themselves, why do the lords of the West sit there in peace unending, while we must die and go we know not whither, leaving our home and all that we have made? And the Eldar die not, even those that rebelled against the lords. And since we have mastered all seas, and no water is so wild or so wide that our ships cannot overcome it, why should we not go to Avalane and greet there our friends? And some there were who said, why should we not go even to Aman and taste there, were it but for a day, the bliss of the powers? Have we not become mighty among the people of Arda? So, some are like, why can't we go to Avalane, right? Which is the, it's the, I believe it's the city on the, on Tol Eressëa. It's the city that they can actually see from, on a clear day from the Mental Tarma. And then others are like, why can't we even go all the way to the Blessed Realm? I don't want to just stop at Avalane, but I want to go all the way to, the Blessed Realm. So, they're kind of, you can see how this works, right? They kind of amplify, or, like push each other to push even further, like pushing that boundary. Okay. And, you can hear people like leaders, being like, yeah. And then like followers being like, yeah, and like kind of egging them on, right? It's like, why can't we go all the way there? I mean, and this is, you could see that easily leading to this idea of like, well, and if they stop us, why can't we just go past? Aren't we powerful enough? Look what we did to Sauron, right? Look, he's a Maya, just like he's a god, just like them. Look what we were able to do to Sauron. And so it says, the Eldar reported these words to the Valar, and Manwë was grieved, seeing a cloud gather on the new tide of Númenor. And he sent messengers to the Dunedain, who spoke earnestly to the king and to all who would listen concerning the fate and fashion of the world. The doom of the world, they said, one alone can change who made it. And were you so to voyage that, escaping all deceits and snares, you came indeed to Aman, the blessed realm, little would it profit you. For it is not the land of Manwë that makes its people deathless, but the deathless that dwell therein have hallowed the land. And there you would but wither and grow weary the sooner, as moths in a light too strong and steadfast. But the king said, and does not Eärendil, my forefather, live? Or is he not in the land of Aman? To which they answered, you know that he has a fate apart, and was a judge to the firstborn who die not. Yet this also is his doom, that he can never return again to mortal lands. So, the Valar insist, the Eldar report on behalf of the Valar, report back to them. So it's clear that, word about this had gotten to the Valar, and basically the response of the Valar is like, we can't do anything. Like, it's not up to us, okay? It's not up to us that these rules are in place. It's really up to Eru Ilúvatar. And they even press so far as to say, well, hey, our forefather Eärendil, dwells in Aman, and they say, well, he has a fate set apart, plus he can't actually return to any mortal lands. So it's not exactly the best deal for him. He has his own longings, right? He can't just go anywhere he wants. Interesting response there from the Valar. And this, of course, you think like, okay, they're probably not going to respond to that, unfortunately, at this point and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Sounds good. We understand. They're pushing. Like the discontent is so deeply rooted right now it's like this cancer in their souls, right? And you can see how maybe as it grows, it's almost like robbing them of the ability to enjoy the here and now. It's like that great saying, which I learned several years back. What is it? Comparison is the thief of joy. I might even go like kind of modify that just a bit and say envy is the thief of joy, right? When you envy, right, and you let that kind of take root in your heart, you're unable to appreciate the things that are right in front of you, the things that you actually have, right? Because you're like, why can't I have what they have, right? So we see how that has, that's really kind of, that seed has been sown in the souls of the Númenóreans, and it's going to continue to grow until it kind of takes over a lot of what was good there before. And so the Númenóreans respond and they say, well, why shouldn't we envy the Valar? And the Númenóreans answered, why should we not envy the Valar or even the least of the deathless? For of us is required a blind trust and a hope without assurance, knowing not what lies before us in a little while, and yet we also love the earth and would not lose it. Then the messenger said, indeed, the mind of Ilúvatar concerning you is not known to the Valar, and he has not revealed all things that are to come. But this we hold to be true, that your home is not here, neither in the land of Aman nor anywhere within the circles of the world. And the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Ilúvatar. It became a grief to them only because coming under the shadow of Morgoth, it seemed to them that they were surrounded by a great darkness, of which they were afraid. And some grew willful and proud and would not yield until life was reft from them. We who bear the ever-mounting burden of the years do not clearly understand this. But if that grief has returned to trouble you as you say, then we fear that the shadow arises once more and grows again in your hearts. Therefore, though you be the Dunedain, fairest of men, who escaped from the shadow of old and fought valiantly against it, we say to you, beware. The will of Eru may not be gainsaid. So, this kind of gets to the heart of, why this was granted to them in the first place. First of all, they say, like, the will of the mind of Ilúvatar concerning you, it's not known to us, right? So even the fate of men, the ultimate fate of men is not known to the Valar, these great gods, right? The men are like the greatest mystery of Arda, okay? And this is why that in my mind, all of Middle Earth is in a way like a meditation on mortality, on like the nature, the metaphysic of mortality, of that question of why must we die? Why must we die? But they say, this we hold to be true, that your home is not here, nowhere in this world. It's not in the land of Aman or anywhere within the circles of the world. And the doom of men, that they should depart, was at first a gift of Ilúvatar. Now, you might be wondering yourself, how in the world does that work? How in the world could death have been a gift of Ilúvatar? It became a grief to them only because coming under the shadow of Morgoth, it seemed to them that they were surrounded by a great darkness of which they were afraid. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because, with we can't misunderstand that men were mortal or were immortal at one point and think that think they were immortal at one point and became mortal because of some original sin within the cosmogony of Middle Earth. It seems very clear that Tolkien had in mind that men were mortal from the beginning. So the end of life in this realm was not like the final, wasn't some judgment. It was the reality for men. It was the reality for the second born. It was the thing that primarily distinguished elves from men, the Eldar from the Atani, the Quindi from the Atani, right? One was immortal, bound to the life of this world, right? And one was mortal. One had a definite end to their life in this world. And I think that's so interesting because, growing up for me as a young Christian, I always had kind of understood that that man was created immortal, but had because of the fall had become mortal, it had become a thing that they would have to die. But over time, and having especially become Catholic and been exposed to a lot more, kind of a broader sweep of theological thought, especially going back into like the early church and that kind of thing, and this all connects to Tolkien because so much of he's bound so much in his own mind to to kind of the traditions and theologies of Christianity. But going back to when I was a child and thinking about these things, my mind really transformed as I became older, as I kind of dove into a lot more theology and just kind of different branches here and there. And really, I think my view now would be, and not to say I'm any kind of authority on this question, but my view would probably be more like, well, man was meant to live a life in this world that was a life that I think we would call bliss, right? Kind of maybe the life we would live in this world, but then he was intended to fall asleep. The doctrine of the Assumption is really something that kind of enlightened me on this, right? And this is the idea that that the Virgin Mary, it's the Catholic idea that the Virgin Mary was conceived without original sin, right? So she lived a life free of sin in this world, in this life, and but then at the end, she did finally die, but it was more like a peaceful falling asleep. It was more like a peaceful falling asleep. It wasn't like this like fearsome thing, but it was like this complete, beautiful trust. And one of the things that I was taught to pray for when I would pray the Rosary, when I would pray the decade that pertains to the Assumption, was to pray for the grace of a happy death. And as the years notch up for me, I've thought more and more about what the grace of a happy death, what that means, and just the idea of being able to die peacefully in a way that whether maybe it's like surrounded by your family, but ultimately it's like in a way that like the people around you see you pass and somehow feel blessed, right? That they were a part of something holy, right? That they were a part of you being born into eternal life. And I think if I had to kind of build a case, build a deeper case about this, I feel a certain degree of confidence that we'd find that Tolkien had. This was kind of his idea, and I will say, like Tolkien's own writings have influenced me on this note, right, too, and this kind of change in mindset. So anyway, just to kind of summarize that, I think Tolkien would say that like man wasn't born even before falling under the shadow in the cosmogony of Middle Earth. Man was meant to be mortal, like he was meant to live a certain life and die peacefully, and I think we see that in the early kings of Númenor, right? Maybe even a longer life. Right, like we kind of see in the Old Testament in the Bible, how they're like people living like 700, 800, 900 years, and then it starts to decline, right? So they live that long life in this world, but then are able to fall asleep, and the next generation comes along, next generations come along and live their lives, but that's not the end of man's story either, of any individual man or of mankind as a whole, right? But it's not really known what lies beyond that for us. All we can do is trust that it far exceeds anything we could hope for, right? And that's my hope. That's my hope as a Christian. So there was one other thing I wanted to say about this, and I think it slips my mind. I might have to come back to it. But thank you for indulging me in that, because that whole question is a very fascinating question to me, and I think this chapter on Tar-Atanamir really gets to it. All right, but Atanamir is kind of ill-pleased at this idea that he has to leave this world. I know what I was going to say. Yeah, these first kings and queens, or these early kings of Númenor, like really fell asleep in peace. Like they passed on power peacefully, and then they were able to kind of live out their lives and kind of die peacefully. And we see that start to change as well. All right, so it was to Tar-Atanamir that the messengers came, and he was the 13th king. And in his day, the realm of Númenor had endured for more than 2,000 years and was to come to the zenith of its bliss, if not yet of its power. But Atanamir was ill-pleased with the counsel of the messengers and gave little heed to it, and the greater part of his people followed him. For they wished still to escape death in their own day, not waiting upon hope. And Atanamir lived to a great age, clinging to his life beyond the end of all joy. and he was the first of the Númenóreans to do this, refusing to depart until he was witless and unmanned, and denying to his son the kingship at the height of his days. For the lords of Númenor had been wont to wed late in their long lives and to depart and leave the mastery to their sons when they were come to full stature of body and mind. Yeah, so we learned Atanamir is like at the end of his life, and contrast this with Elros, right? At Atanamir at the end of his life, he's clinging to his life beyond the end of all joy, right? He won't let go. He won't just like lay down, fall asleep, and allow himself to pass over into the arms of Ilúvatar, right? He refuses to depart until he was witless and unmanned. That's such an interesting phrase there. Witless and unmanned, right? Just no long. He's like barely even a man anymore, right? And he denies to his son the kingship at the height of his days. So we just get this picture, like it's we see that you can see that transformation, and as the ruler goes, the rest of the society is going to go, unfortunately. So that is really the story of Tar-Atanamir. He refuses to lay down his life. But what's interesting is simultaneous to this, and this, we're dealing with, the early 2000s of the Second Age, right? And it's roughly what, let's check our timetable here. So it's roughly 300 to 400 years, well, probably closer to 500 years now since Sauron was defeated. But right around this time, we learn Sauron begins to rise again. He wants to become a king over all the kings and is a god unto men. He hates the Númenóreans for many reasons and fears they will wrest from him control of the East. The Númenóreans were now rivals of Sauron for power over Middle-earth. So Sauron has kind of resigned himself. Let's do our map thing here. Sauron has really resigned himself to, I can be happy, at least for now, ruling over the lands to the east. So you kind of think like he has influence over the area east of the Anduin, and to the west is really, where the Númenóreans and the Eldar still have a lot of sway. So I would say, Sauron's kind of looking this way into the mysterious east that we know very little about, while over here is, he doesn't really concern himself too much. But he does view the Númenóreans as rivals. He's afraid the Númenóreans are becoming more and more powerful, maybe even more aggressive. He sees their power, and he's afraid that they're going to actually come in eventually and maybe start to attack his lands in the east, because it's like, why would we want to wait for him to build himself back up? Of course, it's been 500 years already, so he's probably already in the process of doing that. So Sauron, even though he's afraid of them, and he sees them as rivals now, he doesn't dare to challenge them yet. All right, so why was Atanamir called the Great? Well, I don't know that we get a lot of details on that, quite honestly. And the only thing I can think is that maybe he was called the Great because the people that came after him may have viewed him as asking these big questions that were very consequential for the turning point of Númenor. You think of like rulers in actual world history that have been called the Great, and they usually preside over a big change in the society, like Peter the Great, big change, for Russia, really modernized Russia. Like Alexander the Great conquered all of these lands. I think really Atanamir was called the Great because, not really in this moral sense of the Great, but because he had, I think, a big influence on the rest of Númenorian history with his perspective on challenging the Valar. And he must have seemed very great in the eyes to those who were his strong supporters, right? People who were saying, like, yeah, keep asking these questions. These are the questions we should be asking. Why was he called the Unwilling? Well, I think that's pretty clear. He was unwilling to lay down his life. He was unwilling to die, and that changes the trajectory of Númenorian history as well. We start to see that the power in Númenor is going to start becoming a contentious thing, a much more contentious thing. So he refuses to lay down his life, and that is why he is called the Unwilling. He's unwilling to die. All right. Next time, we will look at the reign of his son, Tar-Atanamir, as well as the coming of the Ringwraiths. All right. Well, I think that about does it for this episode. We had our piece of correspondence from Durenair concerning the mistake I made with Cariatur and Cariatan. So please do keep that correspondence coming. We'll do our best to respond to you somehow and at some point. Don't forget to stop by truemistpress.com for great merch like super stylin' and comfy Tolkien Road t-shirts, True Trees camper mugs, and signed copies of my books. Once again, that's truemistpress.com. Thanks for supporting our work with your purchase. And thank you to our amazing patrons, especially the following: John R., Kaitlyn of Tea with Tolkien, SaberSystems, Melkor27, KG, Emilio P., Jonathan D., Richard K., Robert H., Paul D., Julia, Wordy, Joe Bagelman, Matt R., John W., Eugene D., Alaskan Moose 31, Chris B., Daniel S., Corey C., Carolyn S., Emil K., Seb M., Ms. Anonymous, Andrew T., Red Hawk, Shannon S., Brian O., Zeke F., James L., Chris L., Aja V., Ish of the Hammer, Teresa C., David of Pints with Jack, and Eric B. Thank you all so much for your support. Thank you all so much for being part of our fellowship. And thanks to everybody for watching and or listening. We will talk at you next time. Bye-bye.